We're going to be talking about in this the role of technology in the public sector, and what do companies like Code for America that are very much focused on human applications of technology, what are they doing? Now, we've got an incredible speaker who's going to be with us to cover this, Amanda Renteria, who I've known for several years. And by the way, we're neighbors, which I love because I get a chance to bump into her in the neighborhood and all of that. She is the CEO of Code for America, and Code for America is very much focused at this intersection of technology and government, and it is looking at a variety of tools that they can provide. And there's a variety of them that have been really interesting solutions. So the solution, some of the things that they have launched, ctc.org. This is an online tax filing portal that allows people in collaboration, by the way, developed in collaboration with the White House and the Treasury Department, allows over 115,000 families to date claim tax rebates. And it's added up to over 400 million in value over 10 weeks in 2021. Get Cal Fresh is another application. So basically, this is an online tool that allows people to apply for California aid for food services. By using the technology, they've been able to reduce the application time from 45 minutes to 12 minutes. Third area that they focus on, all of these are illustrative of the work of the organization, Clear My Record. It's a free online tool that helps people with eligible convictions clear their criminal record, eliminating barriers for impacted people to move forward with their lives. The technology automates the process of record clearance, helping governments clear and update records for up to 10,000 eligible convictions per minute. So a bunch of great things that the organization has done. We've got an incredible moderator with us. This is going to be like two, powerhouse leaders here. Ted Ross is going to moderate. Ted is the Chief Information Officer for the City of Los Angeles. He's also the General Manager of the Information Technology Agency. His department in the City of Los Angeles, he's got 450 employees. They deliver IT services to over 48,000 employees in the City of Los Angeles, and digital services to over 4 million residents in the city. He was appointed by Mayor Eric Garcetti in 2015. He's got 21 years of both private sector and public sector experience. He's received a variety of awards along the way. #1 Digital City, Top 25 Doer and Dreamer, CIO of the Year from the Los Angeles Business Journal. He's been in a variety of publications, Fortune Magazine, Wall Street Journal, spoke at the Andreessen Horowitz Tech Summit. Recently published the City of Los Angeles Smart City Strategy for the 2028 Olympics and the city's digital strategy. He's got a bachelor's degree in accounting from Edison State University, MBA from Cal State Dominguez Hills. Please join me in welcoming both Amanda and Ted. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much. So tall.
Excellent.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. An excellent introduction. And by the way, I work in government. She services government. Record anything you like. Your taxes have already paid for it. So just put that out there. You're already getting a bit of a different feel and a different vibe. So it's super exciting, as Terry mentioned, to have Amanda Renteria here from Code for America, CEO for Code for America. And I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction regarding her background, because I think the content is really important, but really where she came from and what brought her here, I think is also equally important. So her career has been really quite diverse. She started off as a financial analyst at Goldman Sachs. Then she shifted over to being a teacher in a small hometown. Then she went to public service. Public service included a budget analyst at the city of San Jose, chief of staff for U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow. In fact, she was the first Latina chief of staff in the U.S. Senate. National political director at Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, chief of operations at the California Department of Justice. In addition, on top of all those, if she wasn't busy enough, On top of all that, she ran for Congress in 2014, winning the Democratic primary, and governor in 2018. Before joining Code for America, she was the interim president and senior advisor at Emerge America, which is a candidate training organization that recruits, trains, and provides a network for Democratic women who want to run for office. She holds a bachelor's in economics and political science from Stanford, an MBA from Harvard, and today she sits on several nonprofit boards. So, another round of applause for the very busy Amanda Renteria.
Thank you.
Okay, so now that we've gushed over you so much, Amanda, and completely put you on the spot, and I know you're a humble person, so it's probably a little bit awkward, right?
Yeah.
You're known for high-impact technology solutions and initiatives that really impact the public because government utilizes it and it touches a lot of people's lives. What are some of the recent accomplishments of your team over the last year?
Yeah, so it's been a really interesting year for us. Just to start off, because people often wonder, like, how did you end up at Code for America? Like, you know, you're on a presidential campaign running around the world and like we're around the country, and then why that? Especially because you've been in public service for so long. One of the things that led me to where we are today is when I think about democratic institutions, when I think about how our country and our world works, we have to again believe that democratic institutions can work. And when I looked around at that point in my career 2.5 years ago and went, where are the places that are actually linking people to government in a way that actually builds trust in the system, builds trust that government can work again? Code for America was there. They've been there for a decade. We were first starting out as Get Cal Fresh, which is the food assistance app here in the state of California. We learned where government actually was not meeting that connection to real people that you're trying to serve.
Wait a second, Amanda.
Yeah.
At times, government does not connect with the people that we serve. I think that people online and people in the room, this might be the first time they're catching that.
And technology can help, right?
Yes,
it can't do all things, but it can certainly help bridge that gap, particularly in the world that we're in today, but also as we think about what our government should be into the future. How do we make sure we're utilizing technology in that kind of way?
Yep.
And so for 10 years, we've tried to figure out how to partner with government to basically just help them connect. We've also focused on low-income communities, really trying to figure out, recognizing that for a lot of different governments, some of your hardest to reach communities often get left out, not just because of policy, not because of desire, but because the systems aren't quite working. And so who's focused on that? And so our mission is, how do you work with states, governments really at all localities, to make sure they can actually reach people, utilizing the technology, but also the user research we've done from the conversation before, and be able to link those two. And so some of our big work, and I'll say, I was lucky when I joined because for 10 years, Code for America has been trying to convince governments that you can do this stuff digitally,
Yep.
that you don't need to walk into a building for 10 years. And then the pandemic happens and it becomes very, very clear that you actually have to figure out this digital side of it. How do we do this in a real way? And so for the last 2.5 years, we jumped in right at the beginning of the pandemic when schools could not get school lunch programs to kids. And we started to work with about a dozen states to figure out how do we actually just break down barriers, data share, do all we need to do on the back end so we can actually reach kids now in a digital kind of way. We did that. Child tax credit passed. So that's probably our flagship that most people know about today, and probably the thing that has really shaped Code for America now going into the future, which is child tax credit passed, huge goal of reducing poverty by 50%. And then we get on the phone with the White House and Treasury and say, how are we really going to do this? Because
how do you take it from idea to real execution?
Right. Huge idea. Awesome.
Yep.
Right. We love that. Politicians love that.
Of course.
But how do you actually make sure it actually delivers? And so that really allowed us to look behind the scenes and say, well, let's take a tech product approach. Let's pilot a few hundred people from a lot of the work that we had done in the past. Let's use some of the understanding we knew about the target we were trying to reach, which was people who had never filed taxes before. By definition, they're the lowest income families in our country. And so we piloted it with a couple hundred people. And what we found is No one made it through the process but one, and it was wrong.
Wow.
Which means they were going to be stuck in the system.
So according to my math, that's a 0.5% success rate, right? Okay.
And
then what? What'd you do then?
And that really led to a conversation of what do we need to actually get it right so people can actually get through a process. It meant working with really deconstructing some of the administrative rules, building a mobile app, using the technology, starting small and piloting it.
Sure.
Until we got to how are we making sure we have good throughput. And so our biggest, that's probably one of the biggest flagships now is that we were able to figure out how do you have a very simple mobile process for the first time in 2 languages for really designed for people who had never done it before.
Yeah.
And that's how we ended up with 440 million now distributed tax benefits. This year, we finally were able to launch in Puerto Rico, right when there was the floods, people were wondering, what can you do? And as it turns out, I mean, these are the things most people don't know, sometimes the boring stuff of what we see in government, but
sure.
You actually need an entire different system for Puerto Rico just because of the way the laws are and the way the system works. And so we finally were able to do that this year and launch it. So that's been really exciting stuff. And what I'll say is, while it's awesome to see the throughput, the most important aspect for us is that we made people believe that government could actually do it. And I don't want to really sidestep that because, you know, when you've been in government for a really long time and you heard, well, we can't do this because of that or this parameter, when you finally see something work and go, wait, we can do it. And that's what the pandemic really did for us, is it allowed us to show what was possible. More importantly, it helped a whole bunch of public servants go, we can do this kind of interesting stuff, and re-inject that energy.
Yeah, I would hate to understate the importance of private sector, but the reality is in private sector, quite often, when you move the needle, you're increasing your profit, right? You're increasing innovation, very notable things. What you just described was moving the needle and allowing people who were in poverty to then start to get out of poverty. You move the needle and you had a group of people who weren't engaging with their government, who are now engaging in a very meaningful way. And that last point that I thought was really interesting that you wouldn't want to miss is she was also convincing, her organization was convincing government on a better way of being government.
Yeah, and what's interesting is on the other side of that, there's a whole heck of a lot of awesome public servants who go, I do want to get rid of this pile that's piling up, but I don't know how.
Right.
Right? And I do want to make sure that we can serve. That's why I got here in public service. And so that part of it, particularly during a pandemic where I think it was very difficult for a lot of government, just government employees in general, to be able to see that kind of win. Where it worked, it was different. And then we'd love to share the stories of what people actually experienced on the other side.
I feel like before the COVID pandemic, we were all preaching and evangelizing on what digital can mean and digital transformation could mean in public sector, right? We see it in private sector. What does it mean in government? When the pandemic hit, there was no choice anymore. Now you were forced to deliver services in a contactless way. What do you see as some of the biggest technology opportunities in government today?
Yeah. We have really looked at not only the work we do across the organization, but really recognizing when do those windows open. So I think when any new policy exists, we take a real hard look because it's much easier to start at the very beginning and set in place a foundation of what the expectations should be. Right? So the minute we did the child tax credit, people just thought you should be able to do your stuff by mobile app now. All right, how are we going to do that?
Yep.
And so we really do look at things like broadband equity. I think a lot about the climate bill and the Inflation Reduction Act that just passed and all the different policies that are in there. How do we make sure that when policy happens, you actually are able to see implementation on the back end? So our focus at Code for America is really taking a look at what are the new policies that are coming and how do we make those real? Even getting out of the politics of it, but broadband equity passed or broadband passed. How do we just now make sure people are on the map and can actually get it?
And I love that conversation because honestly, and as a practitioner, no matter how good the technology is, it's extremely difficult to automate a broken process, right? If you have an extremely complicated process, it doesn't matter how sophisticated, how many focus groups you put together, it's extremely difficult to get to a good outcome. So by catching on the front end, you're actually embedding digital strategy or digital philosophy and digital transformation into how you implement the program. And the fact that Code for America America is not just on the back end offering solutions, but trying to connect early on to have a productive conversation seems to be exactly the direction where you want to go.
Yeah. Well, and that's been one of our learning lessons over the last 10 years is you can make a fantastic, wonderful product, but you can't force it in government if you really don't understand what the key barrier is. And so I often talk about our work as the art of learning where our client is, right?
Sure.
The art of learning where states are.
And speaking of the art, an expression I've loved over the last few years was corporate judo. And keep in mind, we're not describing even things that are just exclusive to government. Large corporations have a lot of the very same characteristics or require a lot of the very same skill sets. And what I mean by that is anyone who's familiar with judo, you're often using the weight of your opponent against them. So if someone's pushing on your shoulder, you're using their weight to throw them to a ground, score the point, etc. And you often find in government that our elected officials or legislatures are very well-meaning when they create a law or they publish a policy, but you need to apply a certain level of corporate judo to turn their good intentions into something that's maybe digitally feasible, right? Something that could be actually effective. And they often don't mind you taking their weight and adjusting it in the proper direction. It sounds like with the child tax credit, that was some of the conversation, is let's take a good intention, let's couple it with good processes and deliver a great solution, as opposed to just having something that is very hard to automate.
Yeah, and when I think about where do you take it next, like what does a future vision look like? I would love to have been at the table actually as that policy was developed.
Right.
And that is what we're doing in automatic record clearance. So when you hear about cannabis laws all of a sudden coming off people's record, that's nice to say, but for anyone that might have cannabis laws on their record, they've got to go get a lawyer, a court date, a whole entire process.
A huge barrier of entry just to even get into it.
But the law is there.
Sure.
It's almost that the system itself becomes unjust now that the law is just.
Correct.
And so how do we make sure that we smooth that out? And that's the role we play now in automatic record clearance is how do you make sure on the front end that you've got the policy in place so that you can actually deliver on implementation.
So tremendous opportunities in technology and in government. What have been some of the challenges you've been recently seeing? And I know we only have a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, the overall distrust is really tough. And we really bumped up against this in the child tax credit. You know, it's not surprising. Taxman shows up at your door, you don't click on that link. No. Right? And we're trying to actually reach people to say, these are your benefits. And so some of that is really the deep, deep distrust that just people have right now in government that we bump up against. It's why when you have forms and systems come to you, you really do try and say, welcome to this app. Mm-hmm. I mean, just that alone, that's not how government feels. I don't know if anyone has gone into a social services office, but when you walk into a social services office and you have to go through the metal detectors because you're just trying to get your food benefits, that's not quite the sphere we should be in, right? And so it's no wonder that the public has some distrust and really some fear in addition to it. And so what we can do, if we can bring down that distrust and begin to show what kind of relationship we can really have, maybe it's through your phone and technology, but you can actually reset that relationship in ways that begin to start to bring back not only the country together, but a trust that government is actually trying to be there for you.
Yeah, I think it's really important. The city of Los Angeles, the second largest city in the United States, I'm dealing with a constituency just from the resident side of 4 million people. The reality is no matter how big SoFi Stadium is, the Coliseum, the Rose Bowl, I couldn't get everyone into a physical community gathering even if I wanted to. But I can connect with them digitally. In fact, I can deliver digital services that represent our government well when maybe even an in-person interaction may not have gone so well. Yeah. Are you finding that a well-done digital service can increase or improve the trust and the sentiment regarding government, even if for whatever reason the people themselves may not even necessarily fit that category?
Totally. And we have to tell people, like sometimes people are like, God, that was so good. I wish government worked like that. And you're like, it was.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
sure.
There is that. And so having been a longtime public servant and in policy, oftentimes people forget to like put the bow on it so people know where it came from or why or how it worked. And I think that also is the important feedback loop as we think about how do you steward, a city, a state, a country.
Sure. The city of Los Angeles, we're very well known for the 311 solution. So it's a call center, it's a website, it's a mobile app.
It's awesome.
We get 2.2 million requests a year. And yet, when Loyola Marymount does their survey for Angelenos across government services, 311 is consistently one of the least recognized services that the city provides. Because over and over again, government is not great at PR. It's not great at marketing or even selling itself, even when we have like an award-winning solution. What would you say, shifting gears a little bit, because I think there's a lot that industries can learn from each other. And I work in government. I joined government after 9/11. There's a lot of fantastic things that happen in government, but at the same time, we know that the reputation of government doesn't fit that category. So what would you say what do forward-thinking private sector companies get that government should understand?
Iterate. You know, I think this idea that, you know, healthcare.gov is one thing everyone always thinks about, like, our government totally failed. Well, nobody rolls out the big thing and they're like, it's going to be perfect, here you go.
Yeah.
Right? That's not the process. But government is actually held to that standard.
Sure.
And so much, I love this. I don't know if any of you followed the student loans rollout, but they actually were like, this is beta, here you go.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Sure.
Right. So that has been learned.
Amazon does it, Google does it, Facebook does it, but government's not allowed to do it.
And DOE, some of our friends over at DOE were like, oh my God, we got way more people in the beta than we thought. I was like, because it was kind of cool.
Sure.
You're part of a beta. And so it's not just that it's taking those applications in the private sector, but I think government has a really cool, unique way of being able then to kind of bring people along a journey and bring them into the buy-in process as well. Like, you are part of like building your government together. We aren't just presenting you, here is what it is, but we need you to help us make this better too. And I think that is actually the best or beauty for me of a true vision of a government that works by and for the people.
And I think one effective aspect of that is then the constituent feels a part of the journey.
Totally.
So they're even more engaged in their government.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
good. Now let's flip it, because I think for most people, the stereotype is government, laggers, private sector leaders. What would you say a forward-thinking government has to teach or offer a private sector company? What could they learn from a forward-thinking government?
Yeah, I often appreciate my Harvard Business School friends who are like, why don't you just do this, right?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry, Amanda, I've never heard that in government. Yeah.
So I often get that. I think one important piece to remember about government is they actually do have to serve folks in the private sector really don't need to figure out necessarily, or they don't. They're looking to do the hardest to reach communities. That is the mission. If government isn't there, then who else is? And when you start to design systems with that frame in mind, I think there are a lot of lessons learned on the back end of how it can be even better. I think the obvious example of that is sidewalks. When sidewalks were put in for our communities with disabilities, and now we stroll around with our kids in strollers on those sidewalks, and they've beautified our neighborhoods. And so if government could, or if private sector can take them for a moment to step back before they have that new product or that new thing and say, let's just try and think about how would we reach that community who isn't connected to us right now? What could we do? And I mean, maybe it won't be profitable, but maybe it's really simple. And instead of asking a question like this, you ask it like that, because it'll actually reach more, let's say, diverse communities. And so government always has to think of that. I would love more forward-looking private sector companies to lean into that brainstorming a bit.
Yeah, it seems like in the private sector, we're arguing over what markets to work into. In government, it's all the market.
That's right.
They have to touch the entire market. And what's really interesting too is one would think that just having like the diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of conversation, I would often find to think that if private sector pursued these other markets, they actually might find profits where they never would have realized it before, or deliver better products.
They might. I mean, we found this in Minnesota when we were helping to get to all sovereign tribal nations for the first time, and they had two different systems. On the back end, it wasn't, I won't name names, but it wasn't that hard for the vendor to go, let's do this, right? I mean, we came up with it, we were like, here's the barrier. Wait, vendor X, why do you do this? And they're like,
Right.
that's why we've always done it. And you're like, if you just change this, it will link.
Sure.
So I wish there was more of that.
Sure. I completely agree. It seems like Code for America and everything we discussed, whether it's the pandemic, pre-pandemic, the opportunities that digital provides government, the opportunity that government provides to private sector, it really seems like Code for America plays a unique role at this time in history. And I don't want to overstate it, but it really is. We're at a unique place in history when it comes to digital services and when it comes to connecting with the people. What is your vision for Code for America for the next few years?
Oh, just that. So I think I think you're right in terms of we're a really interesting space right now where digital delivery has come into view in a real way. I also think we're resetting a lot of our systems in government because we have to.
Yeah.
And what I have found is there is this gap where and it's mainly based on new policy coming in or a new transition happening, like in the IRS right now, there's a modernization process, where governments can't quite move fast enough to get there, and the private sector is still trying to figure out the profit motive. And that's where we can come in and shape those early kinds of conversations to say, here is the mock-up, or here is the demo, or here are the factors and different stakeholders to bring into this process at this very moment. So I am excited. We are taking on or have been working in the tax benefit system. We received $100 million in April to transform the safety net systems with 15 states, unlocking $30 billion in benefits for 30 million people. Those kinds of transformative moments for us is endless. Because in all fairness, when you think about technology really transforming all kinds of different industries, it has yet to really do that in government in a way, particularly for our mission, that can really reach low-income communities in a new kind of way for a new generation that is wholly different when these systems were built.
Right.
And so in that sense, the work is truly endless. And over the course of the next couple of years, our goal is to really, how do we be that innovative partner as more and more systems transform for a new generation as we come out of this pandemic and really redefine who we are as a government and as a society.
I think transformation's the right word, often gets used quite a bit, often becomes a buzzword, it's used so often. But when you think about it, it's not just enough to have technology.
No.
And it's not just enough to quote unquote be digital. Digital is a mindset, it's a philosophy, it's got agile software development, it's iterative, it's always learning, it's embedding emerging technology, it's using traditional technology. And it seems that really government has done steps to become online during COVID, but the transformation, to your point, has yet to be achieved. And it sounds like Code for America is one of those organizations who wants to make that happen.
Yeah.
Am I right when I try to summarize it that way?
You are.
Okay.
I appreciate that summary.
Good.
And it's awesome to see not just the app being used, it's awesome to see in the state of Louisiana, they have a client success team now, right? We put out a texting playbook. We've been helping governments text for a long time, but we got a couple states who, can you just put the playbook together and we can run it and then we can go agency by agency and do the same thing? You're beginning to see that kind of thinking and change. And that's when you're like, oh, we're getting it. It's not just about going from paper to online, but it's a way of thinking, a way of being.
Yeah.
And what I hope is that we could also embed this kindness and this responsibility and this almost community orientation to kind of the work that we do too, because I think that's the opportunity, is not just changing the way we do it, but the tone and feel and style of how we interact with our government.
That's right, completely agree. Let's shift gears a little bit from Amanda the CEO to Amanda the person. Okay? Tell us a little bit about your journey. I mean, we went through a lot of different positions. You've got people who are maybe early career, you've got students, you've got mid-career, you've got late career. Tell us a little about your journey. How did you end up here?
Yeah, gosh, sometimes I'm not exactly sure. It's because I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up.
Sure.
I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up.
So young folks, make a note. If you don't know what you want to be when you grow up, you could still end up very successful.
I grew up in the lowest income congressional district in the state, in the Central Valley of California. My parents were farm workers. And that framing for me has always been real in a lot of different ways, not only in what motivates me to do the work I do, but also in thinking, how do we have a kind of world that ensures you really can, achieve your potential? And so that's been kind of the North Star of my life. For the first time ever, I'll say that my parents actually know the work I do because they know Get Cal Fresh all this time. They're like, Mika, you're there, you're doing policy. What's that? I was like, Mom, Get Cal. And they're like, yes, we know that. So perhaps it's just been the journey to figure out, to have them figure out what I do. But listen, I believe that it is our responsibility to have walked the walk I've walked, to figure out a way to shape the leadership of this country in the best way I can with the kind of tools and talents I have. And I still believe government is the place of impact at scale. Even despite what it's feeling like right now, 5 days into leading to a midterm, even that, it still is the thing that will shape my kids' life, my grandkids' someday's life. And I think it's still shaping the world, especially living here in America, where people do view what we do, they mimic it for better and for worse. And so I've always in my career wanted to be in a space where I can sort of help make that a little bit better. And so that a kid who grew up like I did can actually go, yeah, I can do anything, right?
Of course.
And they don't need to know what they need to be when they grow up, but so long as they see themselves a part of the leadership of this world.
Excellent. No doubt you face challenges,
Yeah.
right? You're a woman working in technology, you're a Latina, and honestly, you face challenges across multiple industries.
Yeah.
If you're up to share with it, what are some of the challenges, or what are some of the key challenges you faced, and how do you address them?
Yeah. Partly is you just know they're happening, right?
Sure, yeah.
None of this work is easy. And I think it's partly bringing people into my world a bit, right? I mean, I feel really fortunate to have grown up in rural America and then to have lived in Brooklyn during a presidential campaign and known what that's like. And we've visited, our sovereign tribal nations when we're doing this kind of work. So to the extent for me that I can just bring people into other people's lives or their work, that has been the most fulfilling. Not only is it really cool to see that cross-pollination happen, but it actually is what allows us to do the work we do, to be successful in what we're doing. I mean, we face this all the time where people are like, why didn't that community learn about Get Cal Fresh? Or why didn't this? And what you do is when you walk over and you actually walk through, whether it's the metal detector to understand how to apply for services, or you walk through that community and you realize, it's because there's no broadband here. I can't even get online. So no wonder we have 0 applications coming from this place. I think putting your feet, not just saying I'm going to put myself in someone else's shoes, but actually going to go do it, is truly how I feel like I've been able to manage those challenges. And it gives me a little bit of empathy, because not everyone did grow up the way I did, right? Not everyone does have the heart and passion for trying to figure out how public service works. Sometimes I just want government to get out of the way.
That's right.
Right? And I get that too. My dad ends up being a small business owner, and he too often calls and be like, really? Why did you do this? I was like, Dad, I don't even work for that agency. Like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, just yesterday I was blamed for the air conditioning issue at the convention center and asked, what am I going to do about it? Because it's too cold in here. So certainly in government, you feel like you're accountable for all the good or bad that folks do. I think it's really interesting that, we live in an information age, and yet sometimes our own ignorance and our own bias can be so extreme. And how much what you were describing of simply crossing that invisible line and engaging with people in a very human way, we often become much more informed.
And it's more fun, right? You get a sort of broader sense of what is going on out there. Why are we having these divisions? And it feels a little less divisive when you actually show up and experience and actually are able to see and reflect.
We're about to take questions. And so, if you haven't before, go ahead and get up onto Slido. The code is TS2, lowercase ts and the number 2. Go ahead and submit a question. We've got a mixed audience here, both online and of course in the room. What advice, let's now talk with the young folks, or even the not so young. What advice do you have for students who are interested. I mean, they maybe have liked what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Maybe it really gravitate to it. Maybe they really jive with it. What advice do you have to students who are interested in public service and technology? Where do they start? How do they proceed? What's some advice you could give them?
Yeah, so I'll just make a pitch for, we are still a very, I'd say even a new ecosystem in GovTech. And so getting in now, I mean, even over the last couple of years, what I have seen of vendors, smaller vendors pop up, what I have seen of nonprofits take on tech talent or take on unemployment insurance while we're taking on safety net. There's been such a growth in this space and will continue to be. This nonprofit sector that really sits adjacent to government. My advice is there's a ton of opportunities. We have openings as well. But I believe this is the best time to get involved in this movement because things are opening up, because people recognize digital delivery, and we need your talent. I'll also say, I know we have, it's sort of the not quite new term, but never underestimate your lived experience, whatever it may be. I think for probably too much a part of my life, I didn't necessarily talk about where I grew up or what I did, but man, it shaped the way I thought about policy.
It matters.
It shaped when we were doing the Affordable Care Act and I was 8 months pregnant while talking about whether or not maternity care should be in or out,
Yeah.
right? Those kinds of things. And that's the beauty, I think, of people thinking about their career is it doesn't need to be separate. It actually is, and you will be better for bringing who you are, how you show up to that space. And so it also just makes the work much more meaningful, whatever sector you're in, private sector, public sector.
I agree. I think I find often that some of the best people I've worked with show a passion.
Yeah.
And if that passion is absent, it's a job and they're not going to be very effective at it. But truly, if they're passionate about it, then it's like the old cliche, they're really not working. They're actually doing what they love and getting paid for it.
That's right. Also say you don't need to know like what the long-term plan is. And I think sometimes we get really caught up in thinking like, oh, well, if I want to be there, I need to do that. I don't think roads are as straight anymore.
Sure.
And by the way, it's a heck of a lot more interesting to figure out that path.
Yeah. My dad was an aerospace engineer, one of 3 sons, all told effectively to go into engineering. I was the black sheep. I became an accountant. As an accountant, I then ended up in financial systems. My 2 brothers are both in tech. Getting into financial systems, before you know it, I'm a chief information officer for the 2nd largest city in the United States, and I'm way more big tech than any of my brothers ever got into. And my dad, to all of it, the compliment he gave me through all of it was, I'm so glad that you work for a company with a pension. And that just shows you this very strange circular aspect to it. My attempts to get away made me even way more mainstream than they did. So we've got some fantastic questions here. So go ahead and feel free to add questions and also, like questions that you want to hear regarding. So the U.S. is, here's the question. The U.S. is significantly behind European countries in implementing digital government. Not sure about that, but that was the assumption they put in there. What are the state of California challenges to get there? So how do we compete with folks like the European Union when it comes to it?
Yeah, I don't think we compete. I think we learn. It's also really, in some ways they are, in some ways they're not as much. It kind of depends. I just actually, I flew in from Ottawa because it was a Forward 50 conference and it was quite a few Canadians, but really a global conference talking about what's happening in technology around the country, around the world. And it is interesting. There are just some systems that are quicker, like Canada is able to say, here's what our form filler is going to be, and everyone's going to use it. And I was like, oh, that would be so nice. Mm-hmm. But I think we got to take what we do or who we are in our structure and say, all right, if this is a 50-state experiment, great. How do we do that as best we can and learn from it and grow? I do think some of what we have learned, and I would argue at the federal level anyway, our digital services teams are pretty connected with what is happening in the UK. Estonia is actually the country that is often held in highest regard for how they run their tech. Mm-hmm. But I will say that there are a lot of learning lessons. ID verification, what did other countries use versus we used? So it's happening now. It's not happening as much as it should be. The pandemic changed that. There's a ton of now consortiums, collaboratives, and philanthropy going in to being able to share that kind of information. I will say what is missing is there's still not a wealth of best practices and knowledge for reaching diverse communities. How do you reach immigrant communities? How do you reach different speaking communities? How do you get to folks who are more disconnected, like our tribal nations that aren't connected to the system in the same way? That part is purely the beauty of America in trying to be this experiment we are.
That's right.
And so we will, as we develop that more and more, we will lead the efforts for the UK and others on how to do that in the best way possible.
Yeah, and in my experience, it's breaking that question into its components. When you think of a digital city, you often think of 5 pieces. You've got infrastructure, right? You've got data, tools, and practices. You've got digital services. You've got governance, how you run the whole thing. And then you have the aspect of digital inclusion and connectivity. If you were to start to spread it across global cities, I'm jealous of the city of Seoul and the infrastructure they have. But when we partner with the city of Seoul, they're jealous of our digital services. They'll roll out an app that few people will use. And that's not the way they want to deploy a smart city. And so as you start to go around the world, you see not only different levels of maturity across these areas, but you also see different value systems. The city of Paris is all about sustainability. For them, a smart city is a sustainable one. In Amsterdam, they're focused on community and how to engage the constituency. So you'll find that digital even gets evaluated differently in different places, which is fascinating.
Really, really cool. Like if you think about just languages, right, and it tells you a little bit about the culture.
Yeah.
I think kids are gonna look back and be like, oh, I get it. Like that's why that is and we're seeing it show up in technology. You're absolutely right. It's, I think, one of the more sort of culturally fascinating pieces of the world I get to see now across the globe of how technology is implemented, deployed. Which tells you a lot about, what people are looking at, thinking about how they communicate. There's such a cultural aspect in it.
I would agree. Second question. This one's in the great context of the Great Resignation, the Great Reflection, whatever you want to call it. What are some of the ways the public sector can better compete against the private sector for top-notch tech talent?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I feel like I have this conversation every week.
Of course you do.
Even as like Code for America people are like, do you think I should go over in government? I was like, yes, it's going to be great. And then like 2 years later, they're like, finally it came through.
Yeah.
And that's partly what I mean. It takes a really long time. I mean, a lot of our, what we are trying to do in our partnership is actually bringing a team right next to the state-based team. And what we have learned is it's helped now go, okay, you've worked on this project for 6-7 months. Do you move that team over there? Do we have people who want to move over there? So it's happening, but we're modeling it now. I don't have, and I think what you would hear from the tech community and a lot of the folks on my staff is they're just not ready for tech talent yet. And there are some places that are. So the idea of seeking the innovation centers in cities, there's quite a few of them now that are really sparking up. Those are great places to be, but I also don't want to discourage you from going into the agencies themselves. I think sometimes tech folks will go look directly and go USDS or the CIO's office or the technology center of whatever state, city, whatever. They also need you in Department of Justice. They also need you, right, in Department of Social Services. And so that's the part that we are particularly talking to government about, is how are you stretching to make sure you're actually building your tech team within the agency themselves that are sitting at the table with your caseworkers, as an example.
What I often find that underlies a question like that are certain assumptions. And so the assumption is, how could private sector apples to apples compete with public sector? How could public sector compete with private sector? Being that obviously there could be greater pay opportunities in private sector and certain other opportunities. But the reality is human beings aren't simply driven by pay. And what government often fails to do is provide the employee value proposition. When you really delve into the numbers over the last couple of years, compensation is obviously important, but no one wants to make a lot of money at a job that they hate, are terrible at, and are miserable doing. It's clearly not what they want. There is huge work-life balance in government. You get the chance to touch really important things. You're not a small cog in a really big wheel. Sure. You're often a really big cog who are about to deploy something, fingers crossed, to 4 million people, right? And it was you who developed it. It's you who will manage it and maintain it. And the innovation, especially if you are with certain progressive organizations, is there. I mean, just yesterday I'm talking with one of my developers. I was speaking at the Blockchain Summit over at the Convention Center, and I'm chatting with one of my developers regarding the wallets we're using and the chains we're doing for doing vendor certifications in blockchain, right? And that person does this for a living. And so those do exist.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And I think that, I mean, we sit in between them. So we're a little government where we have really fantastic work-life balance, and we're a little quirky where we do things that government couldn't do in terms of just the fun, different aspects that we can do as an organization, the flexibility, et cetera. And I do have to say, I am hopeful about a whole new generation looking for work that really is mission forward, that really does sort of say, I actually want my work to like land and matter for a long time. And that feels really cool in government. And I do think we are seeing openings, just like you're saying, that are beginning to go, how do we meet you where you are? Because people recognize we do need to start bringing in this talent. And then you get to get inside and you get to shape it.
Yep.
And I would have said 3 years ago, it's really hard to come into DOJ and try and quote shape culture and do these innovate. That is not true anymore. So if anyone tells you that, I just don't believe that anymore. You really are beginning to see government shift and think differently. That, I mean, I remember when Attorney General Becerra was like, no one can take their laptop home, right? Like, we just can't have that, right?
Uh-oh.
Really? Right. And
Here
now,
comes the virus.
So all of that, though, has changed,
Yeah.
right? And so that's why I believe this is a great time to be in this space, whether it's government, nonprofit, private sector that's working on GovTech.
And honestly, there's tremendous both horizontal and vertical movement. So I started my city career, I was at LAX. I was helping run an SAP system. So I'm all SAP ERP. Then I ended up shifting to the controller's office. I become responsible for a $55 million software project. Then I go to an IT department. I'm running a data center, data networks. Like it's unimaginable sometimes all the different opportunities you could jump around because governments are big and moving yourself around governments actually is another way of getting it done.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Another question here. What's your advice for minority individuals who work in the public sector when they are challenged on their ideas, experiences, and validity?
I mean, it happens. So that's true. And my way of doing it is I always tried to, again, you're bridge building, right? You're always trying to figure out how do I put this in terms that someone else can understand. I think we have a lot of tools today. I think people recognize lived experience. When I used to, I think early on in my career, if I would have said lived experience, I think people would have rolled their eyes and been like, I don't know what that is. Amanda, can you just go do the numbers? But now you can actually be forward thinking about laying it out and saying, here is the picture of what we're seeing. Here is the community's voice. And here's what I need you to do. I'll say this just as a manager, I guess, is often we will hear what needs to, what is wrong. What is extremely useful and helpful is here are some solutions, here are some ideas, here's A, B, or C, right? Or something else I haven't thought. Just even that alone. And I think over the course of my career, I make a judgment sometimes whether it's best to lead with my lived experience or it's best to lead with like more of my business case scenario. And I try just as a person to have the flexibility to do that because the end goal is to be most effective. And so, yeah, what I don't have good advice for is the way that feels at the moment. And so I'm sorry for whoever asked that question, because that is really hard. And over the course of my career, I try and figure out how do I take that feeling and then work to make it a productive landing when I have that moment or that shot. And I still will say the best skill set, I think, and I wish I could even be better, is how do I know more languages? And I don't mean just Spanish and English. I mean languages of technology, of education, of government, of private sector, of business, of education. The more you can and now technology, the more you can know those languages, it's absolutely amazing. Partly what we do for government is we've come in as partners and we give them new languages or new words like client success. They might have always been doing customer service, but all of a sudden client success, and you get to redefine it and reshape it. And so, yeah, so part of what I hope is we are all translating bodies and translating our world to others. So the best we can do that, I think that's where I've found my success in doing it.
I love this discussion because if you just roll back over the last 40 minutes or so, you've described times where you apply your talent, you apply your education and your experience, and you apply your narrative, right? And so this person's asking a question saying, listen, I'm in a certain situation, and they have a talent just to even get there. They've been educated, no doubt, in the role that they're in, but they also have that life experience, that narrative that no one could really argue with, right? But to your point, it's thinking about, in the mission of that conversation, the organization we're in, which one of these or what combination of these do I apply to help drive that mission forward?
That's right.
Interesting. Very good. Here's a good question. Politicians are often driven by incentives. How does Code for America convince politicians and institutions to make investments in technology and modernization?
Yeah.
What's in it for them?
I can't say I've totally figured this one out yet, to be fair, because folks just, it's really back end in a lot of what we do. And so the best way we have been successful, and by the way, for the last, I'd say it's only been the last couple of years that we've surfaced more publicly. We actually appreciate, I mean, it's Get Cal Fresh. It's not Code for America, Get Cal Fresh, right? It's child tax credit. It's not Code for America, child tax credit. And so we have intentionally been behind the scenes. What we realized is if we want to make truly national scale, though, and national kind of impact, we probably have to pop our heads up a little bit more, particularly if we need to move major barriers. So our way of doing that, and I'll take some examples in safety net and child tax credit, is really to say, listen, we know your intentions. We're here to help you just make it real. No matter what, whether you're in a blue, red state, like that's all we're trying to do
I
here.
believe it was Vidal Sassoon who said, if you don't look good, we don't look good. I think that often happens in politics.
That's great. But I think the real magic is when we get to a time where elected officials go, think about implementation at the front end, right? And so not as a scary thing like, oh my God, I'm gonna put this policy, it's not gonna happen, and it's gonna backfire in an election cycle, but I have the team in place, here's what we're gonna do, technology is gonna help us get there. That part has been a little bit harder for politicians to truly grasp. You're beginning to have, I think there's some models of governors who have come out who have intentionally said, we are gonna bring a modernization platform. We haven't even figured out the word, I guess is kind of an indication too.
Sure.
That we haven't figured out how do you do it in a way that it is the driving force, not just the back end. So my answer is I don't know yet. We're working on it as we speak to figure out how do we actually shape and bring politicians along, especially in light of we're gonna have a whole new set of leaders after this midterm election, and how do we approach them to say, we can help you with your food assistance programs, or we can help you with, and here is why it matters or why you should care. Certainly they're afraid that if the system doesn't work, that's a motivator. I'd love to be more on the hope side of that though.
I would agree. For those of you in the room, for those of you who are online, I know I found this to be a fascinating conversation about technology, about government, about private sector, about politicians, and I think for me, most importantly, kind of steps that we can do with technology to restore our democracy. So I hope you've enjoyed as much as I have what Amanda Renteria has had to offer, CEO for Code for America. So a round of applause for Amanda.